I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful to Madam Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Mr. President, we have no doubt that today's meeting has been called by the American delegation with only one purpose: to continue destabilizing the situation in Venezuela by imposing on this country its own approaches and recipes to resolve the problems which it has encountered recently. The meeting which we are being forced to be present is another element of the strategy of the United States to effect regime change in Venezuela. We regret that in this unethical ploy, the United States is involving the Security Council. However, since we have met today, we would like to share with you our principal views on what is taking place. Let us be absolutely honest. The topic of today's meeting is not at all the situation in Venezuela, as the organizers are trying to present it. And by the way, today the Council is clearly divided on this issue. Today, we are examining here, unfortunately, the most typical case of what is called, quote-unquote, a threat to international peace and security created by the threat of the use of force against the political independence of a state, end of quote. The authors of the UN Charter, and by the way, among those authors, and one of the main authors, were the United States, tried to save the world from these kinds of events, included this warning in Chapter 2.4. But obviously Washington hasn't opened that book for quite a long time. Such gross interference by the United States in the internal affairs of another state is nothing new. The Americans have not changed and judging by everything, do not intend to change their relationship to Latin America as an area of exclusive interest of the United States, a kind of backyard where you can do anything you want without taking into account the interests of the people living there. We're talking about the reincarnation of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, about which President Trump openly spoke during his statement at the high-level segment at the 73rd General Assembly. Back in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson spoke about how the United States intended to teach the republics of South America to elect good people. And well, today that lesson is being visited on Venezuela, who dared in the recent past to conduct an independent policy that does not comply with the economic and political interests of the warden who watches over the Western Hemisphere. I would like to quote the words of another American president spoken in the Congress on the eve of the creation of the United Nations. He was one of the founding fathers of this organization. He considered this his main political project and truly believed that its creation made it possible to ensure humanity would not experience wars and conflicts. I'm talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Yalta Accords, and I quote, ought to spell the end of unilateral actions, spheres of influence, balance of power, and exclusive alliances that have been tried for centuries and have always failed, end of quote. Unfortunately, the real policy of the United States in the Western, and not just Western Hemisphere, is in stark contrast to these noble and just ideals. Regime change is a favorite geopolitical game of the United States. It's no secret for anyone Washington's attempts to undermine Nicaragua. The fact of open interference of the United States in the internal affairs of the state was confirmed by decision of the International Court in The Hague in 1986 as part of the Iran-Contra affair. At the time, the United States tried to finance Nicaraguan rebels. The Cubans well remember the Bay of Pigs. The Chileans will never forget the role of the United States in overthrowing Salvador Allende. In front of our very eyes, the attempts by the United States to impose their will on other nations is being complemented with another chapter. And this is just some of what Washington has done just in Latin America. The nations of Africa, Asia, Middle East, the Pacific region, and Europe have quite a bit to add to this list. So against this background, the inventing out of thin air of so-called evidence of interference in the United States elections, as well as the accusation of other countries in malign policies, appears not only absurd, but practically funny. On the 20th of May of 2018, the Venezuelan people once again supported Nicolas Maduro as the president of the state by giving him almost 68% of the votes. And now, anticipating this situation, Washington did everything possible from the very start to discredit the vote and cast a shadow on the re-elected executive of the country. In particular, there is enough evidence about the fact that on a number of opposition candidates, strongest pressure was exerted so that they would withdraw their candidatures and not compete in the elections. Ultimately, using the pretext of a boycott by part of the opposition, the United States and their allies started implementing a plan to overthrow the legitimate authorities of the country. And as we know from the American press, actively participated prominent members of the Congress of the United States Congress in this process. Prominent members. Now, hot on the heels of the election, an attempt to overthrow the government was unsuccessful, and so Washington tried to destabilize the situation, including through the Organization of American States and a number of neighbors of Venezuela. But, as is well known, it was not possible to adopt an anti-Venezuela resolution at the Permanent Council of the OAS. They were not able to push that through. The organization, there's not enough support in the organization for these plans, which is quite indicative. Today, we're witnessing the culmination of these efforts, time to coincide with the inauguration of the legitimately elected president. Extremist opponents of the legitimate government, having failed to defeat Maduro, including by physically removing him, have chosen a scenario of maximum confrontation. On the 23rd of January, the President of the National Assembly proclaimed himself as the interim president of Venezuela. The United States and a number of other countries immediately recognized him, thus confirming that they either abetted or were directly involved in this artificial creation of a parallel government, which now threatens with serious destabilization within the country. National Security Advisor John Bolton made a Bolshevik-style statement about the expropriation of all Venezuelan property on the territory of the United States, while, on the other hand, the allies from the opposition have been promised financial support. We strongly condemn those who are pushing the Venezuelan society to the edge of a bloody bloodbath. The United States are painting a picture of a confrontation between the Maduro regime and the people of Venezuela. This picture is far from reality. In spite of everything, the leader of Venezuela obviously has broad support among the people. And by the way, according to sociological surveys conducted in October of 2018 by one of the structures, an organization close to the opposition, the National Assembly, the leader of which is currently being positioned in Washington as almost a president, is not supported by almost 70% of the people of Venezuela. And once again, about the elections and about being informed. The distinguished representative of the United Kingdom spoke about stuffed ballot boxes in Venezuela, suggesting that the elections were rigged. Well, just for information, there are no ballot boxes in Venezuela. It uses an electronic system of voting. Now, supporting Venezuela, we first and foremost are against the violation of international law, in particular provisions of the UN, which clearly condemn any interference in the internal affairs of independent states. Furthermore, from the American leaders are making suggestions that they might be ready, even willing to use force, talking about all options being on the table. Using the presence Secretary of State Mr. Pompeo. We want to ask him directly, does that mean that the United States is ready to use military force against a sovereign state under a bogus pretext? Because it is here in this room that we need to hear a clear answer whether Washington intends to once again violate the UN Charter. Secretary of State Pompeo claims that only China, Russia, Cuba, Syria, and Iran are supporting Maduro. Well, if Secretary of State would find the time to stay here in this room a little bit longer, he would hear directly how many states condemn the policy of internal interference into the internal affairs and regime change. These countries are not there to support the Maduro regime. What they are here for is to support international law. And I think the Secretary of State has already had a chance to hear this. Possibly in the context of the notion of rules-based order, which has been promoted by our Western colleagues, such actions of overthrowing rogue regimes are welcome by them. But international law classifies such actions quite clearly as a violation of the UN Charter, and in particular, Chapter 2.4. We consider this behavior unacceptable. It undermines the principles of the UN Charter and the basic norms of international behavior and relations. We would also like to address our Latin American partners. Do you understand that in case in case you continue with your actions, tomorrow, instead of Venezuela, any other Latin American country can find itself in its place. The illegality of what is taking place in Venezuela is flagrant, and the leadership of the Organization of American States salutes this, and following Washington rubber stamps threats against an independent state. We're convinced that to resolve the Venezuelan crisis, a number of obvious and simple steps need to be taken. First of all external interference needs to stop, and there needs to be an end to propping up the leaders of the opposition. Secondly, all efforts should be made to launch an inter-Venezuelan dialogue and attempts to find a solution through negotiation. A determining role can and should be played by the neighbors of Venezuela. We know that similar initiatives are already being put forward. Lastly, thirdly, we should refrain from discriminatory economic measures against this country. It's no secret that the current economic crisis is to a large extent provoked by those countries who are the first to cry about the suffering of the Venezuelan people. And I would like to make correct something that Secretary of State Pompeo said. We did not block the presidential statement proposed by the United States. We made certain constructive amendments which we are sure were wholeheartedly supported by a majority of members of the Security Council. Some will be supported, many of whom have already done that. Some of them have already supported that. So the ball now is on the side of the American delegation. It's up to them. But we're not sure that this kind of statement is based on carefully weighed assessment of the Secretary General, which confirms the sovereignty of Venezuela and the fact that interference into its internal affairs is unacceptable and its constitution should be respected, something that we believe that it's important to lower the rhetoric and to refrain from threats and ultimatums. And it's important to contribute to having a dialogue, a normal dialogue and negotiation begin in Venezuela and for the situation to be stabilized. We are ready to contribute to this, and we call everyone to assist us. Thank you very much.
My thanks to the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor now